Good to see you, Michelle. So this
Oh,
theme, it's about stories and how we use stories in creativity, how stories pass on cultures, how they strengthen cultures. So tell me about what your take is on the impact of stories on our identities, values, and behaviors.
sure. Uh, well, I look at stories a lot these days, through the lens of creativity and emergence. And I find that there are stories, first of all, there's stories within stories on almost everything we think or everything we're going to create. I think that stories inform our relationship to everything, our relationship to our creativity, our relationship to our unknown, our relationship to different parts of ourselves, our relationship to others, our relationship to who we see in our tribe, who's not in the tribe, our relationship to our culture or other cultures, and our relationship to the world. Do we have stories that it's a hostile world? Do we have stories it's a benevolent world? Uh, and so I think there are stories really are at the heart of everything. And within every story can be multiple stories, whether they're stories we grew up with in our families, stories we made up as a result of something that happened to us, or stories that came from our culture or our teachers or our institutions. And so I actually think stories within stories are almost at the heart of most decisions we make and our relationship to how we create and what we create.
You've used the word relationship so many times, and that word is very powerful because I think you're absolutely right that stories are about relationships, whereas when we think about the life sciences, for example, the life sciences, when they want to uncover, explore, discover facts, logical facts, they isolate elements, they isolate variables. And so things are explored in isolation, whereas with the social sciences, we look at things, we look at the interrelationship and the patterns and the connections between different elements rather than trying to isolate. We can't study the experience of a person in isolation. We have to look at their story within, as you say, the wider context, which is the bigger story, and that bigger story can become bigger and bigger and bigger. So yes, so I agree with you that there are stories within stories. So there is your story, like your lived experience, and there is the story. So that story, to an extent, you've probably constructed in a conscious manner because of the work that you do, and for some people, they allow that story to unfold in a very deterministic way rather than taking control of shaping and molding their own story.
Oh my gosh, there was so many layers of richness in what you just said. So the idea of constructing in a conscious way. Absolutely. I know the tagline even for my business is consciously creating what's next. So it's about bringing consciousness to constructing new stories, but also that it weaves in our emergent, that we also have places within us that things will emerge that we can't predict. So there's conscious construction of stories, which I do, which also includes deconstructing old stories. I know in different areas of my life, I've gone through different kinds of learning and development processes, different healing processes. I actually had to unravel old stories that no longer served me. And in my work as well, stories about myself, others, my work, my creativity, and then embrace and construct new stories. And then the emergence element has an unpredictableness where you can't construct the story that will emerge, but you can create the conditions which is its own way, you know, creating the story of what are the best conditions for something to emerge. So I would say I do a combination of conscious story constructing and letting things emerge, uh, and then co-creating new stories with what's emerging. So yeah.
In one of the conversations that we've had before, you've talked about the shell, you know,
Mhm.
like when the idea is ready to emerge, it kind of, it's that breaking that shell, it's the pain of breaking that shell. And I suppose that's the same with a story. A story we can't hang a story together without some elements of a structure around that story. We need to know who the protagonists are, the most important protagonists. We need to know where the story takes place, and if the story takes place in one environment, it may be a totally different story in a different environment. And as you say, those unpredictable things, those where the story has been shaped by something which is beyond its own boundaries.
Right, exactly. And the context will give a container for what kind of stories you might bring or what kind of stories can be held in any environment. Just as something as simple as if I work with a corporate group and we're doing something on storytelling, the types of stories that we tell, the types of stories people, both past stories, current stories, and future stories might look very different than if I'm working with a public group of people into their own personal development, or a spiritual group, or an arts group. So the context definitely dictates the story. And I think also the idea of being able to expand the story at any time, given new information. You know, we might have a story about something in the world, or something in ourselves, or something about our creativity, and all of a sudden we explore it, or we look at it from different ways, and the story expands. So it's not even that the old story no longer works, it kind of yes ands, it becomes something new. Like paradox stories where two seemingly opposite things, they both have their own story, but a third story, they can both be true. And so I think a lot of it is exploring what is still useful and relevant or resonant and helpful in a certain story, what no longer is, what stories might you aspire to create. And in that, to your point earlier about the pain, there can be dynamic tension, and sometimes it's painful. Especially, I know, just very quickly, I work a lot with people, and one of the exercises sometimes I'll do is have people tell their 2-minute creativity stories. And in the telling of the story, and sometimes it's actually even nonverbal, they might act it out depending who the group is. In the telling of the story, sometimes it brings up a lot of emotion because they realize the time that their natural innate creativity, from whether it was internal or external, kind of got snuffed out for a bit. And unleashing the creativity to create a new story of I am creative can sometimes be very emotional for people. So it definitely can have painfulness, or at least dynamic tension, when an old story is leaving and a new one's emerging.
And there is that concept that the map is not the territory. You've probably heard of that. And that's similar to a story. A story is simply a metaphor. It's not our real lives. And for example, if I try to create a story around myself that I am an astronaut when clearly I'm not an astronaut, it's not a fact. You know, it will never be a fact in my lifetime. No matter how much I dream about being an astronaut, I'm not going to be an astronaut. So there is the thing about, well, is it, well, if we call it a story, I can create a story around it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the story is related to reality. And then we have the facts about myself. The fact is I am in Birmingham. I'm not in the USA. I'm in England. And so regardless of whether I create a story about being in Charlottesville and sitting around a fire with you having this conversation. It's not the truth. It's not factual. That would be a story. There may be some purpose in creating a story like that, but it's never going to be a fact. And so how do we distinguish between like what the life sciences explore in terms of facts and truths, and the social sciences in terms of what we construct? Because we have to have both, don't we? We can't be totally ignorant of the facts and be wrapped up in our world that we believe that stories are valuable. Yes, of course they are, but what about the facts? How do we incorporate those into our stories in a meaningful way?
I think that's a great question. You know, facts isolated, or data facts isolated, have meaning to somebody, and they're whether someone's conscious or not, they have a story about what those facts mean, because the purpose or the meaning, it still may be an actual provable fact. Like you can observe something, that's a fact, but there is a purpose for it, a reason for it, and the interpretation of what it means could be different depending on who's looking at it and for what purpose. So stories can oftentimes, I see stories as meaning makers. They often allow you to connect isolated bits of data and fact and create a story, a theory, a narrative, something around it. Now, where it gets challenging, right, is when somebody has that story and any of us have a story that we've created, whether within ourselves or something we're observing or that we've bought into, that is not connected to facts. And we believe the story to be true and reality. So that, I don't know the answer of how to avoid that. One thing I do know, as there are a lot of exercises on how to unravel the stories you've created versus the truth. You know, like in your own life, of facts that happened, and then the stories you created. So oftentimes we'll put all kinds of values and meanings and stories around a fact. And if we could parse out and isolate, this is actually the fact of what happened. Here's what I perceived it to mean, or someone else told me it meant. Here's what I thought the other, those are stories about the fact. So that's one way I think to separate it. Another way is, and this may be taking it a little bit different direction, but if you wanted to create, let's say, a future story and you're entering the unknown where you don't know what the story is. And like, I'll just use your example of the astronaut. As an astronaut, you are not an astronaut. I'm not either. And so we could only maybe imagine what that would be. One exercise I could do if I were trying to create a new story or a new some product or new something in my life, one creativity exercise is tell the story from an astronaut's point of view. Tell the story from, you know, a dolphin's point of view, you know, tell the story from any type of person's point of view, and not believing that I know for sure what an astronaut would think, but that might actually expand out the playing field. It's a divergent technique using storytelling from multiple viewpoints to expand out how you see a particular problem to be solved, vision to be created. So I might say, as long as you know that one, you can use made up stories if you're using them purposely, and two, unraveling facts from stories so you're very aware of the story you're putting around certain facts.
When we think about the astronaut, I often see them, or my impression of astronauts are people who've spent decades studying facts, logic, scientific, you know, their knowledge is very scientific. And when you talk about imagining things from an astronaut's point of view, it kind of humanizes the person for me, rather than thinking of them as being kind of like, you know, full of all these formulas and scientific kind of knowledge and almost robotic. But if I think about their story, I can imagine the courage that they have to, you know, to take those risks, and the the story around their families, like the, you know, the sacrifices in terms of like not spending time with their family and spending time simply training and studying and taking those wild risks and whatever. So I suppose the story allows us to humanize and therefore empathize with someone who has a totally different lived experience to ourselves. Whereas if we just think of them in terms of fact, that's an astronaut, so they've studied science, they've probably, you know, their head is probably full of all these formulas and skills that I couldn't ever master. So there is like, there's the factual story about them, and then there is that lived experience kind of story about them, which makes me feel more of a connection.
Yes, I love what you just said. I think that's a huge difference, is stories humanize. And when you know someone's story, whether you agree with it, whether it's a shared experience, whether you can even relate to it, you know, there are people in cultures that grew up so completely differently than I did. I don't know what it's like, but when you hear someone's story, and it does, I believe, increase empathy. You still may not agree with or like what they're saying, but at least you can see where they're coming from. I think also that point of what you were saying with the astronaut knowing their story, we have a tendency to, and we all do this, we're, you know, to label, so, oh, well, if it's an astronaut, he must be, or he or she must be good at science, or if it's you know, an artist, they must be very creative. And I see where this comes home to me constantly is someone will say, oh, I'm not creative, you know, my brother was the artist, I just and it turns out they're an amazing software developer, or they're an amazing cooker, that they're in, you know, and I believe we're all infinitely creative, but we have stories on, we have a collective story on what it means to be creative that is very small, or what creatives are, or who's creative. And so that, I would say, is one of the main stories that I like to work with people, is breaking out of any limitations of that someone not believing they're an infinitely creative person or being, because I think we all are, and we just have stories on what it means. And when you get to tell different kinds of stories, you get to expand your view of yourself and what's possible, as well as expand how you hold someone else. I think storytelling for empathy is so significant. I know in many groups that I've been part of, when people hear each other's stories, there's an immediate bonding and empathy that happens.
Absolutely. And at the same time, it's to do with our interpretations of, like, a word, for example, creativity is interpreted hundreds of different ways, and based on that interpretation, either I will be able to relate to that and say, yes, I'm creative. If you're saying creativity, it's about making connections, it's about seeing patterns, and it's about taking an initiative. If that's being creative, then yes, I am. If you're talking about creativity as in, can I compose music? No, I can't. Can I draw? Can I paint? No, I can't, you know, not very well. And so it's to do with definition. And physics, I did study physics at school, but I was never very good at physics. So no matter how much somebody can say, well, yeah, you know, you can be a physicist. Well, I don't want to put in the time and the effort to develop that skill. So there is an element of that as well, that if I wanted to study art, if I wanted to study story writing, I could, I know that, but I'm not willing to invest that time and energy in it. So it's a skill as well, isn't it? Like any skill, it's up to us whether we want to develop that skill. Cooking even, you know, I can cook basic food, but I'm not a cook, you know, like my brother is. For my brother, good cooking comes naturally to him. It doesn't come naturally to me. so there are, you know, words are just simply labels, and it depends on how we want to interpret them. It depends on how much we want to invest our time and energy in them. You live in a country which has a diverse history in terms of there are stories that have been written and recorded and that are taught in schools, and there are stories that haven't been recorded as much, that haven't been told, they haven't been taught in history and the general curriculum. So how do we learn to live in a culture which is diverse, where some stories are dominant and other stories they still exist, but they are overlooked?
Gosh, that is a great question. I honestly don't feel I could do it justice in such a short time, but I will say it is significant to become aware of the stories that have been overlooked and not heard. And it is significant to give space for those stories to be told. So whatever that means in our own individual lives and with groups that we may facilitate or be part of or connect with, stories do need to be told. Voices need to be heard. Perspectives need to be seen. And, I know creativity values diverse thinking, diverse perspectives, diverse histories, diverse culture. And when one story is so dominant over others, it inhibits everyone. And so I absolutely, I do live in a culture where many stories were not heard over historically. And I'm a huge advocate of those stories being heard and every voice and voices being heard. And not just heard, heard, yes, full on, and used to create a new new stories that more people can find themselves under, that more people can interact from, that more people can connect and relate from. So, and that'll, for many of us, means being willing to let go of, old narratives or no longer serve, or being willing to create a space for new ones to enter the consciousness and enter the table, because everyone has such deep wisdom and creativity to add in the creation of new narratives and new ways of working and being and living together that are generative for more people, for sure.
And I suppose you talk about narratives, and I suppose that's what it is. Some of the stories are not heard because they don't fit in with the narrative. There is a narrative that has been dominant, and there's an underlying agenda on supporting that narrative, and some stories support that narrative and other stories do not support that narrative, and so therefore they are excluded from the curriculum. So and if it's excluded from the curriculum, it's like we spend a very significant proportion of our time in school, don't we? And those stories, and this is where the link with identity is so important. Our identities are formed through the stories that we're told. And if we are told stories that we do not see ourselves reflected in those stories,
right,
then that fractures our identities, doesn't it? Because our identity hasn't been nurtured through stories that empower us. The stories that we have been educated with are stories where we at best have been extras, in that story, on the edges, or maybe just not existent at all.
I think you summed that up beautifully. People have to be able to find themselves in a story. And if your experience or your culture or anything about you is not included in the stories in the curriculum, it is extremely challenging. And people begin, to not feel heard and not find a voice. And so I think we need to start including those stories, we need to redo how the stories that we bring in, the narratives that we bring in, from education into the workplace, stories of, and also allowing stories to be heard now, and looking at, given we can't change what stories were heard, but we can change what we'll hear now. We can change what will be heard in the future, and we can create space for it. And we can create completely new ways of being and interacting to allow more stories to be heard. Because it is true, everyone, every soul needs a place to feel a sense of seeing themselves within a story, for sure. And sadly, that hasn't been the dominant narrative. And I think things are shifting. And I think, I know I'm committed. I know one of the things I love about creativity is creativity doesn't care. It's there for everyone. It doesn't care what job you have, what ethnicity you have, what background you have, who you are. Creativity is there for everyone to use and cultivate. It can come to anyone anytime, no matter where you are. And one of the things I love about facilitating and working with creativity is you can get groups of such diversity, from every type of diversity you can imagine, and people can begin to co-create together. And we each do our part within it. And I don't have any answers. I think this is like a story within a story within a story of how to solve it. But I do feel that when we start to look at our own stories and we start to ask, what if I had a story that I want to serve the betterment of humanity? What if that's my future story, that I want to be do my part to serve the betterment of humanity? In what ways might I do that? And we might have to unravel limiting stories about ourselves in order to serve that.
And I suppose creativity, we can think of creativity at the cognitive level and also at the energetic level. And at the energetic level, it's almost as though it's like a powerful force that compels us to search, to explore. It's almost as though it's this, that kind of wind kind of gushes through us. And as you say, creativity is available to everyone because energy is available to everyone, depending on, the capacity that we have to contain that energy. And love is available to everyone. And it's finding that thing that we love, that we feel really passionate about, and being passionate about something. It's democratic. It's like, we can be as passionate as we like.
Yes.
No one's going to stop us from
No
being.
one can stop us in that. No one can stop our own creative energy. No one can stop our own creative, wellspring. No one can stop us having ideas on how we want to serve, ourselves, others, the greater good. No, there is no one that can stop our creative force. That, I believe, is more powerful than anything. And so nurturing our own creative selves, nurturing our creativity, believing in our creative stories about ourselves, believing in our passion. We all have stories. We all have some we've allowed to make them larger, some we just keep them as little, tweets rather than full-on stories. But we all have hopes, dreams, aspirational stories to live into. And we get to choose if we honor those. We get to choose to give them space, time, and attention. We get to choose to write them out, tell them out, act them out, embody them out. And the more space we give to our aspirational stories, the more we draw them out, the more we call them forth, honor them, take them seriously, believe in them, the larger our story can play out in our life versus just being in a reactive story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's about, so feeling that energy, feeling that passion, feeling that love, as it were. I think the more we feel into it, the more that puts us at the center of our own world.
Rather, the more powered we feel creatively, the more risks we'll take, the more we'll try to put something out there, because we are in touch with an energy larger than and different than someone else's opinion or other people's stories. And it's not easy. It takes practice, it takes attention, it takes space and time, and it takes unraveling our own internal stories that might inhibit it, and we can bring it forth. It's important that we take our own aspirational stories seriously, that we take our own passions seriously, that we listen to that inner voice that says, I love this, I want to do this, this would feel great to do in a creative way. If we take it seriously, we'll act on it, we'll learn more about it, and eventually it has more of a chance of coming into our daily living.
Mhm. Yeah, because I know that there is a Native American story about the two wolves. It's like, you feed, like the one that's going to survive is the one that you feed, right?
Yes, perfect. Yeah,
Yeah.
when we feed I call it the creative source. It's the source of our creativity. It's that animating life force, the same animating life force that, births a baby, or makes a tree branch, a flower bloom. We all have this blooming animated life force within us. And if we listen to it, it becomes a larger player in our inner landscape, which eventually leads to it becoming a larger player in our external landscape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so what do you think is still mysterious to us? Like you have been working with creativity for decades. What is still mysterious for you? What do you feel passionate about exploring further about creativity that we don't already know?
Oh, a lot. Well, part of what drew me to working with creativity and emergence is knowing that I would never fully understand it. What's mysterious to me is, or what I know I don't know, that I'm very drawn to learn more of, is in our current interconnected culture, with this level of simultaneous, unprecedented challenges and splits and fears and all kinds of things, as well as all kinds of new possibilities emerging. I have no idea how that would look or come together, or what's next, or what we're creating, or what our new world would look like. So I'm in awe of and service of, my daily practice is truly like, what's mine to do to help do my part to serve it. But it is a giant unknown for me, and it's an unknown that keeps me fascinated, in that, how do I contribute to it, and what are others doing? The other big question I have is, what kind of creativity is going to emerge from this level of crisis? Like the Chinese symbol of crisis and opportunity are the same. I've seen that individually with myself and people I work with, and in groups and in teams. Many times, some of the biggest challenges, create space to birth the most next level, paradigm leaping creativity. So I am in a complete unknown on how that will look, and very excited about it, as far as, I think, in order to solve the problems we're in, and this is not at all original, like Einstein, we have to, the new level of consciousness, we can't solve, like the Einstein quote, we can't solve the problems we're in with the consciousness we created. I am curious of what that next level of consciousness is going to be like, what my next level of consciousness in doing my work is going to look like, what my new story I move into might look like. So I'm curious as how people are going to co-create in the unknown, given we really don't have a map right now.
That's right. And I suppose acknowledging that we don't have a map, that is a great start, because a lot of people will not acknowledge that we don't have a map right now.
Right. I think different people, like we all might have certain principles, certain stories, certain practices, certain ways of navigating. We have tools, we have techniques, we have ways of navigating, but we really don't have a map for what is going to, what this next level for everyone, how we're going to move from the current stories we're in into more life-giving, generative stories collectively.
And that's the thing about leadership, isn't it? Like, as leaders, we are expected to have a story of what the future is going to look like, because we're expected to be able to see more than someone who is not in that leadership position sees. So there is this kind of depth, and in terms of the horizon, we need to be able to see more, further, higher, deeper, wider.
Yeah. Like the visionary leader. And I think, that's a really important role, visionary leaders. And then they get people to often buy into the story, or find themselves in the story and become part of it. So having a vision, I think, is still important. And there's a yes, and there are so many unknowns that I don't think anyone has tapped into the map or the vision for everyone. I think they're just, like in nature, creates in pockets all over the whole ecosystem, and in different environments, and what's needed in, a rainforest is different than what's needed in the desert. I feel there are going to be like people, create from where they are. And those are the sort of the more isolated parts that will come in to co-create the larger whole. And I have no idea how that would happen or what that would look like. But it is I guess it's an unknown story that I hold of.
And it's about having trust in the unknown, isn't it?
Yes. And that goes back to the story of, and our ancestors, the unknown could be a scary place, like you go in a cave, a woolly mammoth could be, so it's good. There's a part of us designed to fear the unknown, which I think is healthy. And it also can keep you out of trouble. It's when that becomes dominant and blocks the adventure and excitement of unknown. There's also an adventure and excitement of unknown. Most kids have that. There's the explore, discover, explore, discover. And we sort of have got educated out of that often, or traumatized, or lost some of that. But when we get more into the adventurous exploration, discovery of the unknown, and the unknown becomes a place that can empower you versus topple you, and the unknown, we expand our story to say, yeah, there's some dangers in it, and there's adventure, and there can be benevolence in it, and there's a natural creative, energies to help us within each of us. I think when we embrace the unknown as something adventurous and something alive and life-giving, that would create a very different story than if the unknown is only threatening. Mm-hmm. I'm a big yes and. Like my stories, I try to yes and my own stories. When I find myself thinking one way, I try to go, and it's also this, But so yes and stories, I think, hopefully are one way, are a part of it, I would imagine.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. That's a great, loads of examples of wonderful stories that you are creating and co-creating and imagining, and imagination is another of those tools that we have, that there is no limits. No one can control how much we imagine, right?
Right. Yes. That we're certain things that are undeniably infinite, how much we imagine, how much we create, how many ideas we get, how much say we can ultimately have when we unravel old stories and begin to create new ones.
That's how life is a great, I always believe that life is always fair. Life is fair because, we're all given the tools of, like, being able to have all the energy that we can muster, having as much imagination as we want to play with. So with all of these tools, then we do have everything that we need, really, to create quality in our lives.
Yeah, and sadly, in some cultures, they're not even allowed to access information about those kind of tools, or they, some cultures that they can't even get online, or but for one, everyone still has that kind of life force energy within. And also, I think the more of us, more people that have access to things and have certain privileges of just around what they can access, when people tap into what's meaningful and purposeful to them, it often is about helping others that may be having a harder time in different ways. So I don't know the answers around that, but I do know that the more people that access their own stories that give them meaning and purpose and passion and creative expression, the more people that can be helped that are at a much more disadvantaged place, and the more they'll be able to help others as well.
Yeah, I think one of the ways to break through our disadvantages are to find others who are more disadvantaged. I think that kind of principle usually works, because I've heard stories of homeless people who've been given £1 and they give 10 pence out of it to someone who doesn't have that. And so it's all to do with, it's relative, isn't it? Our disadvantage is always relative to another person's disadvantage. There's always going to be someone who's more disadvantaged.
Yeah, there are always people we can help. There are always people, there are, and part of knowing ourselves is knowing what we're called to do and for whom. And it may be multiple types of groups and multiple kinds of things. And some may be in our own corner of the world or just in our own neighborhood. And for other people, it might be internationally. And for others, it might be going to tribes, nestled in the jungles. I think we start with our own stories, and then we connect them to the larger one to find more of where we fit in.
Yeah, that's right. It's like, choosing which story do we want to be part of, and who do we want to be in our story, and whose story do we want to be part of?
Right. And in stories that we don't know, allowing that it's sort of like when you start watching a movie, a mystery, you don't know, you allow that you're not going to know the ending for a while. So as you suspend that, so you can go along the adventure, and then until you get to the ending. I think when there are so many unknowns and so much heated and so much happening on multiple levels, we are being, one way to look at it is we're being invited to, just sort of suspend, like to know that we are in something where we don't know the ending, but we are active players to contribute based on what we can do and what we're called to do and what we're passionate about.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Wonderful. Amazing. Thank you very much for this conversation, Michelle. I've really enjoyed it, and I'll speak with you again very soon.
Thanks, Jasvir. Nice to see you.
Bye for now. Bye-bye.